I fought for those who cannot fight for themselves, not just for the minds of Americans, but for those of the whole world. But without kryptonite, I wouldn't truly be human. My weakness reminds me of my humanity, so that I can remember my purpose. I'm not anyone's judge and jury, but I continue to watch your show to help me remind myself of the mental battles that take place, as well as the physical ones.
Okay, thanks, Superman. I would also like to thank Linda Denny from our Facebook community for giving us a recommendation for our guest today. We have someone who is bringing truth to your eyes through the internet. He has created a wide range of YouTube films, presentations, written articles, tons of visual graphics and animations. He has been making a wide range of videos on metaphysics, occult sciences, symbolism, etymology, health, syncretism, and more. He is currently working on publication that will be called Symbols of Power, which I certainly look forward to. Please welcome our guest, Cullen Smith. Thanks for being with us, Cullen. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, how you started making your YouTube channel, how you got into the esoteric sciences, stuff like that?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. It's good to connect with you. Also, recently, I first read one of your notes that you published about. I think it was with excerpts from Gerald Massey about the just very, very poignant symbolism about the serpent. A lot of which, in fact, almost most of which, I ended up covering in. And I haven't actually read Gerald Massey's books before, so going through and reading that for the first time, it was pretty amazing. Seeing how I just, I didn't do any real background research. I just kind of threw things in as they were sort of going along when I was tracing the symbolism for the Symbols of Power Part 3 film. And so, yeah, there was just a huge correspondence there. So I was pretty happy to see those correspondences taking place. So that was real cool. Well, about me, I usually don't like to talk too much about myself. That's one of the things that I really don't like is, everything I do and present, it's not about me whatsoever. It's about the information. It's about the core material that I feel is crucial for people to understand, and they need to really grasp a firm understanding of that information. Number one, to be able to implement, positive change in their lifestyle, a lot of which I have personally implemented myself through my own journey of learning and transforming and bettering myself. So again, that's the core message, is the information itself. It's not about the messenger. A lot of people, critics will try to, make ad hominem attacks against your argument based on the person itself. And so that is definitely what I try to avoid at all times. As basically my main tenet of everything that I do and everything that I recommend is to take what you can from the core message, follow that up, and follow through on your own. And so I got started with all of this back in 2012 was when I first began my esoteric journey of self-discovery, of self-knowledge. Although during that so-called awakening process that I experienced, my awakening came from the information regarding the Mayan calendar in around 2012. A lot of the mainstream information that I had been, at that point of time, I was basically, I was working full-time, 9-to-5 job. And I was, in my free time, I would basically, the only things I would ever watch on TV would be either Science Channel, History Channel. And before that, I only ever watched educational stuff, Science Channel, History Channel, things involving animals, nature, biology. And pure humor, comedy, and those were my main core interests at the time. Although I've always had a huge interest in all aspects of natural science ever since before I can even remember. My first major love was dinosaur species, and I had huge books on and I'm talking when I was 4 years old. I knew pretty much every species of dinosaur, and I mean, I could even name off a lot of the genus, and I mean, a lot of the Latin names of the dinosaurs. So that was my first like real just love of nature and biology, and somewhat a little bit of history in there as well. But so from there, I wanted to be a paleontologist. That was when I was 4 years old, and then I progressed from there. I wanted to be a herpetologist, which is the study of snakes, and but I've always had a core love for reptiles in general. So my main passion, my main love, is all things nature, natural sciences. I love geology. I love biology mostly is my main core passion. It's what I love studying the most because, the more we study nature, the more we learn about nature. And it's amazing how we are just starting to come into our own real fundamental understanding of how nature works. And it's funny that as we continue to that search without, that search outside of ourselves, we start to learn how it really reflects inside of ourselves, which is really the core basic tenet of the Hermetic principle of correspondence, the law, what's called the law of correspondence, which is as within, so without, and that which is above is so below, which is a main, that's the main tenet of basically the fabric and structure of our reality itself. And so that's what we cover a lot of in lifting the veil. And so that's one of the main things, one of my main passions. So during that journey of discovery, I just learned so many things that basically I found all the answers to the questions that I had been wondering ever since I can remember. We start off as children when we're roughly around 3 to 4 years old. That's when we go through this, I call it the why phase. We want to understand our place in relation to our environment, to the world at large. And the way we go about that journey of seeking, because we go through this process of amnesia during the birthing process, or during the process of coming into this world from the spiritual realm, from the realm of pure consciousness. We come into this world of physicality. And we come through the veil of forgetting, which is, through the amniotic sac, the amniotic waters, the amnion, which I will go deep into that in this book that I'm currently writing. I've got a whole presentation revolving around the etymology as well as the symbolism and a lot of the mythology and even some theology mixed in there that goes along with this huge core tenet of basically the veil of forgetting, of forgetfulness, the amniotic waters that we come into this world through. And so through that veil of forgetting, we seek to understand our place in this world and in reality. And it's along that process we go through the questioning phase of why. We want to know why things occur, why things happen, not just how things happen, but the most important is the why about it all. And I specifically remember that phase in my life from 4 to 5 years old, constantly asking why. And nobody around me could ever had the answers as to why. My parents didn't, awesome parents, but they just didn't know, this esoteric knowledge that I now know and have. I now realize that I had been seeking it my whole life. I just didn't know it. I didn't know how to go about it. I didn't know why I was seeking it, but it was there. It had always been there, always underlying my foundation of what I knew about the world. And so, so once I finally found all those answers through my process of seeking about what the mystery of this 2012 Mayan calendar was, which there was lots of shows on the History Channel about it at the time. And of course it was all basically disinformation, propaganda, basically end of the world theories, end times theories, great destruction, cataclysm, the end of the world theories, Nibiru, then you get from that, so I took that search to the internet to to further see what this was all about. And of course, that you get nothing but like end of the world theories, Nibiru's coming back to destroy the world, and aliens and Anunnaki, end times Christian theories, and all of these just complete garbage theories that are out there. But somehow I found my way through all of that stuff and just straight to a core tenet. And that's how I found about the Hermetic sciences, that, basically all cultures around the world share a core foundational mythology, theology, philosophy, what have you. It's all a universal science that all connects everything all together. And it's basically a mother science, a root that all other sciences stem from, and that is basically the study of astrotheology. And that is where I really found, that's where I really came into my own. And there was
not really, but
yeah, I had to mention that. Another one is Michael Tazarian has a great series about astrotheology. Also, Jordan Maxwell has done some very great comprehensive presentations, as well as whole bodies of work around astrotheology as well. And that gets back into, the more ancient sources of astrotheology, which, the great writers like Gerald Massey and a lot of the other great Hermeticists, of course, Manly P. Hall, and many others who have come before that. So basically the core tenets of truth all revolve around that, which is in and of itself, the core of astrotheology is nature itself, is the function of the cosmos itself. So that is where I found myself in relation to the whole, and that is where we will all find ourselves in relation to the whole. And that is ultimately what really matters in this world and in our lives and in our spiritual seeking and in our greater understanding of who we are and why we're here. So that is, that's basically a summary of, a very large and very long, comprehensive story that I could tell about myself, but that's basically it.
Yeah. So what made you consider the astrophysiology topic? Because I know that there's this astrotheology. Not a lot of people are talking about the physiology of the as above, so below in Egypt, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of that stuff that you will find in my Symbols of Power series about regarding what I like to call, is a friend of mine, Caleb Thomas, had first, said the term astrophysiology, and it made a lot of sense to me regarding my Symbols of Power film series. Previously, before that, I hadn't been calling it anything specific, but it is a very unique discovery that I don't say I want to claim it, but I've never heard of any, I've never seen, never read, never heard of any information prior to this. It basically just came through, and I wasn't planning on it being mapped out in the film series the way it was. It just sort of happened. And that's the amazing thing about these, when I'm making these videos and these films, and even just writing, before that I hadn't been writing, full presentations, but since those three major films, I've been trying to write out all of my presentations in basically an article or a book style format before I make the film presentation. That way I have a written transcript to go along with it, and that way I can transfer everything in the video, in the videos and in the film, into an actual hardcover book that you can take offline, which is the ultimate goal of, a lot of my work is mainly online, and I want to take that offline, so that way it will, number one, be preserved, for a lot longer than digital technology might be able to serve us for. But so I first came across that basically, so for people who may not be aware, astrotheology is a compound word of astro and theology. Theos, Greek root word relating to God, the study of God, basically the understandings of what we know about God, as an astro, of course, meaning stars, or astronomy as we know it. So it's the combination. It's essentially at the core etymological root meaning, it means the study of the stars and the heavens, or the celestial bodies as deities, which all ancient cultures, all mythologies, all religions, all theologies, it all is at its core foundation. These are allegories to explain the functions, the purpose, and our relation to our place and purpose amongst the stars, amongst the heavens, amongst the celestial sphere of the cosmos as we know it, as well as the microcosmos, which is the smaller reflection of the larger whole. And we can best understand this core Hermetic principle of correspondence of as above, so below, and basically from the scales of cellular biology or microbiology, studying, how cells function, not just in a petri dish, but in vivo, in the human body itself. So as we study the micro portions of ourselves in our cellular biology, our DNA, our genetics, and all of that comprehensive science that goes along with it, the greater we can correlate those understandings and see how it directly relates to the larger whole, to the macrocosmos, or to the solar system, the universe at large, in a fractal scale, which, a fractal is basically, it's a hologram, and hologram, most people hear the word hologram or holographic universe theory, they associate it with, artificial intelligence, technology, and basically, all things artificial and programming and all of that. Although that's not what the actual word of hologram or holography means. Hologram comes from Greek holos, which means whole, and is the root word also of holy, as well as, which is etymologically linked to health, because to be healthy is to be whole, and to be whole is to be healthy, and you are not fragmented, you are not separated, which, I'm not going to go down a huge etymological train there, number one, because I'll get confused, because it's such a huge interconnected web of words and terms, and that's why I have to try to write it all out in a linear format so that we can really get to the core and follow that thread.
Well, yeah, it's Jesus went around and he would heal people, and he would say, what is it easier to say, that your sins are forgiven, or that get up and take up your mat and walk, right? So this, of course, is related to the zodiac, but he's talking about being healed is what is being saved. So this person was saved today, they were healed today because they're made holy, so they're made whole. Yeah, so I can see that connection there. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. But as with most of what we will discover on Lifting the Veil is that, there are multiple layers. There's, pretty much there can be infinite layers to, just a single meaning of certain things, and multiple interpretations. And, one of the problems I have with a lot of things is that many people just do subjective interpretations of things,
right,
or, based upon just hearsay. And I like to take things so much deeper than that by actually substantiating everything that I like to try to substantiate everything that I say, although nobody can substantiate everything that they say, but
right,
that's my goal, that's what I aim for, that's what I like to do. So there are multiple layers to that, but to get back to the core question of the process of what I call astrophysiology, which is basically how the planets, how the universe at large, the macrocosmos, how it directly relates to particularly what these things have just kept coming out from, I don't even know where, from the universal mind itself, the collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, the universal intelligence. It's basically a download that always comes through every time I start making or in the process of producing these videos. And I usually intend for these videos to be pretty short and to the point and concise. I would like to keep them about 15 minutes long or shorter if possible, 10 to 15 minutes long, 30 minutes at the most. But unfortunately for me, that never happens because as I start putting it all together, it goes fractal. And by going fractal, I mean that it keeps expanding. As the deeper and deeper you go into that vortex, the more it expands and the more you keep finding. And so that's the nature of reality itself right there. And that's what makes it so hard, so number one, so time consuming, so exhausting to try and document all of that but that's also the joy. That's the pleasure. That's the fun. That's the journey of the discovery, the journey of the seeking, is, seek and you shall find. And, it's, although that also basically describing, you know, cognitive bias there, which is, you know, confirmation bias. It's like seek and you will find. It's like, yeah, you look for anything you want to hear or want to find and you'll find it. So, I mean,
Right.
especially nowadays with all the fake news and, you know, disinformation, is you can literally look up anything you want and find confirmation of it. So that's just a funny paradox there, you know, and yet again, multiple layers of meaning to all of this. But as I want to get to the actual core of the work itself, basically what I had found in the process of that is that through studying the hard medical anatomy, the real anatomy, not just like reading old esoteric books and, you know, repeating what Manly Hall or what George W. Carey said, or what some, you know, old philosopher, what some even ancient historians, you know, as many people like to appeal to ancients, though, you know, the ancients were so much more advanced than us, and so it's basically it's a logical fallacy to just appeal to ancients as being more advanced than us. In many ways they were, but in many ways they also were not. And you know, as far as like, you know, Hippocrates, you know, the father of medicine, you know, had some pretty he was very correct about many things, such as, you know, health and nutrition being the core foundation, you know, food being the core foundation of health and well-being, but also had some wild theories like what he called the Wandering Uterus, which, you know, I forget exactly off the top of my head exactly what he thought the Wandering Uterus was, but I think he thought that, but it's number one, it's hilarious, and that could, I mean, we could get into, you know, Sir George Fraser's Golden Bough, who documented like thousands upon thousands of examples of ancient homeopathy and what he called sympathetic magic, and how, you know, so many of the ancient homeopathic beliefs are just hilarious. I mean, they're so ridiculous that it's literally, I mean, I don't know if I've ever laughed out loud that hard while listening to, you know, I was listening to the audiobook version of it, and it was just, I mean, I couldn't stop laughing. You know, and so I'm going off on tangents here. I can't help myself from doing that.
No, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the serpent etymology, because this was part of this reference I had from this lady, but also we're going to be having somebody on who's going to talk a bit more about like the Garden of Eden and these Hebrew words, which actually are talking about the serpent. And so what have you found that sort of would be offensive to like a literal reading of the ancient texts in terms of like the serpent etymology and what it actually represents or what it's connected to?
Well, that is a huge, probably one of the largest, you know, one of the largest specific studies that anyone can go into, is the science and symbolism of the serpent. That's actually was the original title of my Symbols of Power Part 3 presentation. It was supposed to be originally called Science of Serpent Symbolism,
right.
Just because that's sort of what it ended up getting into. And Symbols of Power Part 2 also went deeply into a lot of that. And I never really intended for it to. It just sort of happened along the way, as everything does. I usually never really intend for anything. In fact, I never intended to be doing anything that I'm covering right now. It just sort of, it all happened. And, you know, that's what I love about it, is that, you know, these things just happen. But so the specific etymologies of the serpent, I mean, it's so vast and so broad that, I mean, it's the core archetypal myth theme from all cultures of the world, all cultures, all religions, all theologies. Basically, they revere the serpent in from everything from, you know, Norse mythology, Mayan cosmology, ancient Egyptian cosmology, Hindu cosmology and mythology, Native American, Aboriginal, or Australian Aboriginals, you know, tribes and cultures the world over. The cosmic serpent, you can scale it from, it applies to all scales macrocosmically in symbolism of the universe. So, I mean, when we talk about, if we want to get into the etymologies or anything like that, it can be very specific, but it's very broad, because, I mean, it would have to be a more specific question or something specific for me to cover.
Like for instance, like what's happening for the Bible, because like some of our community, they're studying like eschatology and they're looking at these time statements in the scripture. God's going to make the end known from the beginning. What's happening in the Garden of Eden with the serpent on the tree, and he's tempting Adam and Eve? What would this represent in, say, astrotheology or astrophysiology in your mind?
Okay. Well, again, with every symbol, with every even word, every etymology, every, all of these things, there are multiple layers or levels of meaning to be extrapolated or to be, interpolated about, how we're going to understand them.
Right.
And that's what makes them so powerful and so timeless. And that's what makes them so interesting and so important to study, is because of how many layers and levels of meaning there are to them. So, just from my own understanding alone, like, I could apply it to so many different contexts, so many different circumstances, and in each one, it is perfectly relevant, and it is perfectly substantiated along with the context that is being conveyed. So a lot of these things, it depends upon the context that is being used, as well as, so ophthalmos, meaning eye, is a compound word composing of eye and thalamus, meaning inner room chamber of the inner eye. And I've gotten into arguments with Stephen Banker's of Spirit Science and Metaphysics website over all this theology and the etymology. He claims that ophthalmos can't possibly be talking about the pineal gland, can't possibly be referring to the third eye, and it simply is used in the context regarding the external eyes. But that is not true at all, and I will prove that through the etymology. See, again, they say that it comes from the word ops, meaning eye, plus thalamus. They would have you believe that ophthalmos is a compound word of ops plus thalamus, but that's not the case at all, and the basic needs of human survival. Again, the inner eye, the third eye, as everyone knows by now, the pineal gland, is regulated by the Kundalini serpent energy of the body's central nervous ganglia. In other words, gangs or networks of glial cells, of glia, which are neural cells, which represents enlightenment, or in other words, light within the mind. The serpent energy represents life, rebirth, fertility, divinity, and royalty, as shown by the basilisk, which means king serpent, which comes from the root word of basil, which means king or royalty, basil or basil, king or royalty, which is exactly why the king pharaohs wore the uraeus cobra, or in other words, the king cobra on the third eye, which just so happens that the pons, the brainstem, and the thalamus portion of the inner brain is known as the reptilian complex, which corresponds to the very base of animal functioning, the basic animal nature. But again, the serpent in the tree of knowledge represents Kundalini energy rising up the spine, which is known as Jacob's ladder, or the tree, as well as the human DNA, or DNA in itself, which is known as the tree of life. Which corresponds directly geometrically to other mathematical formulas and Fibonacci sequence in nature, which is what trees follow as well. So in other words, other trees as being the tree of life, in other words, fruit trees being the tree of life as well, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so obviously having knowledge means you have knowledge of both good and evil. This is not bad. This is not something negative. This is not something evil, some religious concept. This is simply having wisdom and knowledge of knowing whether to use that knowledge and apply wisdom to it to do good, or to use that knowledge to do evil. So it can be used either way, but either way, knowledge is power, and knowledge is the key. You cannot achieve
good or evil without having knowledge and without having wisdom. So that is the essence of the tree of knowledge and of good and evil. And all of these ancient depictions of archetypes trampling the serpent, or standing on snakes, or wrestling or grasping, or wrestling with snakes, or wrestling with serpents, slaying the dragon, simply represents having control over your kundalini, your sexual energy. It means being the master of your own energy. It means being a spiritual master, holding control over your own basic human nature, over your own basic animal nature. It means rising above your basic sexual urges and applying the light of the mind to that. It means having control over your basic urges, having control over your instincts. It means rising up and taking control over your own human nature and wrestling with your own animalistic aspects within you, wrestling the beast within you.
Remember, walk without rhythm, and we won't attract the worm.
Recall 1,000 lawyers buried up to their neck in sand. What? Upset?
The Sun Snakes are with me. He told me he smuggled Jamie Lannister into Dorne.
Who's that? Jamie fucking Lannister.
Only one God can save us, but not without his eye.
Jamie?
That's a storm. Sets hunters riding for pets. We should run! Run? We mortals do it all the time!
Ages have passed since the gods walked among us.
Get off the snake with a swarm of boulders. Get off the snake under the collar.
Sugar, do we have one sign? Close your eyes. See the snake. Bob. Moses. Oh! Kiss the serpent. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. But to kiss it without fear will take us through the garden.
A dream where you see yourself standing in sort of sun god robes on a pyramid with 1,000 naked women.
Ride the snake.
We have one sign the likes of which even God has never seen.
Then you shouldn't be afraid to ride. Ride the snake.
Hello and welcome to the $100,000 pyramid, our guest. Can't you feel the darkness?
I'm a light. I'm a light. You say.
Either that or it's just a big ugly eye and I hate it.
Only one God can save us, but not without his eye.
Through the all-seeing eye.
Snake eyes! You got snake eyes! Hey, a snakeskin jacket! I found it! Him! Then!
third-degree master mason of the Blue Line.
The snake in ancient mythology, symbology, and theology is associated or recognized with a female goddess. As well as with the male aspect as well. The snake is a symbol of both the male penis, the male phallic energy, as well as the female energy. And this is the archetypal serpent goddess. This is why we always find the archetypal dragon queen or the drag queen, which is exactly why the drag queens of Hollywood and its magical druidic order always show you the dragon queen, the mother of dragons. The serpent goddess represents the kundalini energy. The kundalini energy comes from the etymology of kunda, which comes from kunta, kunt, kunt. The etymology of kunt, meaning goddess, queen. The only word representing the entire female genitalia, and not just one specific aspect of it. So kundalini comes from kunt, as well as lini, line, ling, lingam, which all refers to the phallic line, the phallic, the pillar, the lingam, the line. The linguini, the lingerie, which are the thin strings, the thin line, the straight line, the phallic line. The lingam, which is the linguistics, the tongue. How the tongue relates is directly linked to the lingam, which is the penis, which I will cover further on as we get deeper into the anatomy of as above, so below the belt, relating to how what is above the belt is directly a representation and a reflection of what is below the belt, as far as glands and organs are concerned, and physiology. The serpent is also found in the trees, where the sacred fruit which bears life and nourishment for all the animals is found. And this is why the snake could be perceived as the guardian of the fruit of life, the fruit which humankind evolved, developing knowledge and wisdom, was from eating the fruits of the tree, the juicy fruits of Mother Nature, the fruits of life, which this planet is a garden where the fruit trees grew all around in tropical regions, very temperate, very moderate climate, where the fruit was abundant, and the fruit is the most dense, is the most nutrient dense and most nourishing food on the face of this planet. It's the simplest food to digest. It is the ideal food of humankind. And I've covered this extremely in depth in my articles because it's the simple sugars that are easily digestible, instant energy, passes right through us, cleanses the body, the most highly detoxifying food that we can put in our bodies. If you want to detox your body, eat fruit. It is the fruit of life. This is why the snake is found in the tree with the fruits and guarding the fruit of life. The fruits, the seed of knowledge and wisdom. When we look at the etymology of the word snake, we go to the ancient Hebraic roots for the word snake. The Edenic word is she-nake, pronunciation, she-nake. In other words, she-nake, serpent goddess. It's a feminine word. The Chinese word she is snake, recalls nikush, meaning divination or magic. Snake magic is all about the creature's neurology, as I've already covered. Snake handling has long been associated with magic, from snake charmers in Bombay, India, to medicine men among the Native Americans. Modern medicine men still uses the symbol of the serpent and the pole, the Asclepius, the snake and the pole, just like Moses and his snake and his staff. In other words, his phallic pole, and his serpent, which the serpent represents the goddess. From ancient Greek, the Pythia, Python, which is why today we still find the serpent goddess dancing with her phallic pole. This pole represents the male, where the snake represents the goddess, the female. So the snake represents both the male and the female. The Kundalini serpents, the Ida and the Pingala, which wrap around the Sushumna, or in other words, the midline of the human body. The midline that falls directly between the bilateral symmetry of the human body. Snake is from Anglo-Saxon snaga, or esnaga. Snaga, Sanskrit meaning serpent, the Nagas. And in the spiritual teachings, we have the two Kundalini serpents which intertwine, the Ida and the Pingala, the male and the female energies, which intertwine up the body, which are red, the colors of red and blue, which the red and the blue, when they converge at the middle, makes the purple, which is the unification of red and blue. And the red and blue relating human anatomy is what we call the Venous System, or the Venous System, as in goddess system, as well as the arterial system.
In the core essence, you know, the serpent is the symbol, you know, of the medical symbol of meaning health or healing, of the as the Asclepius, the serpent and the pole, which is a single serpent and a rod, representing essentially the staff of Moses, where which represents healing. And I forget which author. So I apologize, but I can't remember his name off the top of my head. A friend sent me an excerpt of his, or actually a PDF of his book, and he attributed it to an ancient, not just Mesopotamia, but I think it was that region of Jordan, and that region, that arid region of the world, of the Levant area as well, was that they had this parasite. I forget exactly which parasite it is off the top of my head, but it's a very delicate parasite. It's a long, it's basically like a type of roundworm, maybe even a type of ringworm, but it caused this horrible disease. And it was basically just underneath the skin, and the only way to remove it, at least as far as that medical the knowledge, knowledge of physician, that knowledge at the time, was they basically had to take a stick and they had to slowly wrap it around. They had to slowly twist it around that stick, because if you broke a piece off, then it would end up releasing all these toxins under the skin, and it would get infected, and you would basically die from it. So it was attributed to the symbol of healing and health, or in other words, you know, holistic health, by, you know, wrapping the serpent around the pole. But it's got, you know, that's just one small, tiny layer of the entire meaning of just the health symbol alone. Right. So it represents, you know, with the dual caduceus, which the caduceus, the staff of Mercury or Hermes, is, you know, that's the symbol of the dual intertwining serpents, which are essentially symbolically portrayed as a perfect phi ratio spiral, which intertwine around that pole, which applies from Hindu mythology and theology, which was the Kundalini serpents, of course, the two serpents of Ida and Pingala, wrapped around the central pole, or the central pillar, what in mythological terms is known as the axis mundi, and that applies to every culture, every mythology around the world in much broader contexts and in much broader symbolism. But so it essentially represents the human physiology itself, but not in a literal. It has a literal medical and anatomical context that many people don't really comprehend, or don't really grasp the nuances of what exactly it is and how it works. That's what I'm fully encompassing and fully detailing in what I'm trying to fully compile in my, what will be my published book. But we've covered it fully in the Symbols of Power series, but I'm trying to directly go much more into the detail about that. But so the serpent in ancient Greek was the symbol of the ophis. The ophis was symbolized as the symbol of wisdom, which we can find that in the Bible as being, you know, the serpent of the Garden of Eden, who was crafty. It is crafty. Most people often associate it to deception and lies, as being a snake in the grass, or as being a snake oil salesman, basically someone who has knowledge but uses that knowledge for ill rather than for good, rather than for health and healing. They use that knowledge for power and control and authority over other people's sovereignty and their well-being and their health, which is funny, funny that we could apply that to the pharmaceutical industry at large. Or the medical industry at large as well, which, essentially, for those who know, is fundamentally established by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller Carnegie, this unholy union of massive financiers back in the early 1900s, which itself was a critical period of time. It was basically like a war of the giant minds of the time. I mean, so many great incredible heroes at the time of physics and science and health and understanding, while at the same time so many giants of just pure corruption and industrial evil at the same time, as has been since the beginning of time, which again goes back to the Garden of Eden itself, the fall of man. Yeah. But essentially, most people think that the serpent is evil, that it's Satan, it's the devil, it's Lucifer, it's the crafty one who I mean, I can't go into the details off the top of my head. It's just too deep, too nuanced. And number one, I don't have all the references off the top of my head, but
that's okay.
Essentially, like all things, it represents the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There are two trees in the garden, the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and evil. There are two trees, and we find that symbolism alone all throughout all good storytelling and all really good mythologies as well. One of my favorites being, which I plan on writing a series about, the esoterica of Tolkien's works, and we find the two tree in Tolkien's works as well, who was he himself basically wrote his own mythology. He revolved that around basically an offshoot of the Bible, and he made his own magical, more esoteric, mythological teachings around what the Bible had taught. So the two trees of good and evil, the two trees, which also are esoterically, as Manly P. Hall, I think, was originally probably one of the originators of that. But we can study the medical anatomy. Is the tree of the tree of knowledge, which is the central nervous tree, what's known as the nervous tree in the human body and medical anatomy, as well as the tree of life, which is the tree that basically makes life possible, which is the arterial system, or also known as the vascular tree. So these are the two trees, the two systems of basically of dendritic root systems. Dendrite means pertaining to a tree, and we'll cover this so much more in my Tree of Life presentation series about the dryads, the druids, essentially an offshoot of covering many nuances like nymphs and nymphomania. So many good things going into that presentation that I've been trying to incorporate into my other videos and films, but it's too vast to cover all in one thing. We're going deep into the etymology of it all, where the etymology of what the significance of the tree itself means. I mean, it's so every one of these topics is so huge that it can go on almost infinitely.
Yeah,
and
it's pretty crazy.
Each one of it offshoots into its own entire. So as I'm trying to document and present all of these things, it's almost impossible because it just goes on forever. And to explain one thing, you have to go off into a whole other, what people call a rabbit hole. But it's basically, it's just fractal geometry is what it is. These are fractal spirals of eddy currents that spiral off from the whole of the whole flow of what's life and the universe and the electric nature of life is going on about. So in essence, that's what the serpent represents. The serpent is, number one, it's the sine wave of physical energy, of energy fluid dynamics. But a sine wave itself is not a linear thing as we're focused on. Everything is three-dimensional or multi-dimensional in its actual structure. So a sine wave is actually a spherical geometry. It's just a little portion, a little resonant frequency that creates this entire spherical geometry. Everything in nature is spherical, and it is we're going way off at a tangent.
Yeah. So we at MythVision, we're more familiar with like the biblical esoteric wisdom. I just started studying this stuff astrotheology about a year ago. What are your thoughts? Like, I know in the Bible it says in Acts 7:22, it says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And so I'm wondering, how are the Egyptian pyramids and the temples, and how are they related to today's religions and the Bible and Christianity, or even Islam in general?
Okay, I'll make sure I'm unmuted. Okay, I'm sorry, I kind of got lost. Could you repeat the question again?
So we at MythVision are more familiar with like the biblical esoteric wisdom. What are your thoughts on the Egyptian pyramids and their temples, and how they're related to today's religions?
Okay, yeah, the pyramids are foundational to, it's not just Egyptian, as most everyone knows by now, is that the pyramidal structures are found all over the world, and specifically aligned to geometrical latitudes along the Earth, specific what are called ley lines. But you were referring to Moses and being well versed and containing all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and that's exactly it. I mean, that's what this is all about. It's known as the wisdom of the Serpent Kings, being wise as serpents, and the pharaohs and the Egyptian kings themselves. And we covered this in Symbols of Power Part 2 fully. And delved a little deeper in Part 3 as well. And although I didn't really cover all of the things I wanted to cover, there's so much more that we will be going into in future films and presentations, as well as that the Serpent Kings, the serpent itself is essentially, it's a symbol of royalty. It is the symbol of royalty, such as in ancient Egypt, the king cobra, and in India as well, the king cobra, which was, it's a massive, powerful snake. Beautiful, gorgeous snake itself. So the royal bloodlines, considered, in the East and Asia, known as dragon lines. Even some of these ley lines, the network of pyramidal structures around the world, are also essentially known as dragon lines. So you've got dragon lineage, which essentially it's not, we're not, you can have your own interpretations, but at Lifting the Veil, I do not consider these literal in any sense of the term. I'm not talking about literal reptilians. I'm not talking about draconians and draconian aliens. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. We are showing the core mythology, how it is deeper than that. Maybe you want to consider that, that's part of it as well. But the most important part of that is that it's physiological, it's anatomical, it is allegorical for, number one, for electric cosmology, which again applies to all scales, both small and large. But so the pyramids were, these were not tombs, as modern Egyptology suggests that these are tombs for the pharaohs, and there's no evidence, there's no substantiation to make such claim as that. And the more accurate perspective is that there have been a second cavity found in the Great Pyramid, and there has been measured electromagnetic field being picked up from these pyramids, and they are always typically built over an aquifer structure of the ground, of the bedrock. So exactly like Nikola Tesla built his Wardenclyffe Tower, or his pyramid, directly above the aquifers, just as Dr. Wilhelm Reich also conducted his study of orgonomy, or essentially harnessing the ambient energy of the atmosphere itself, and harnessing not just the atmosphere of the Earth, but even larger to what Tesla attributed as the ether, and the ancient Greeks also called the ether the fifth element, essentially, which is the element of spirit, the fifth element, fire, air, water, earth, and spirit, or in other words, the life force itself, which is essentially its consciousness. So these are structures that are aligned on the Earth, built with locations so that they can harness the negative ion energy of that flowing water, because flowing water through a substance or through a medium, such as eroding rocks, waterfalls, streams, beaches, anywhere that this water is flowing and it's eroding, over the rock, it releases negative ions, and that negative ion it's a negative charge. An ion is literally, it's just a charged particle. And so when you charge a particle, you can harness that it's creating a polarity. It's taking something and creating a polarity, and the whole point of the universe is created out of polarity. First, the universal union, the one, the whole, the holos, the holographic universe, the wholeness of the universe, interacts, it creates everything in this physical universe through division. It divides itself first into an infinite portion, but it does that through duality, through polarity. And so it divides itself into polarity. Those polarities then function and they interact, they dance, they interwork with each other. And that's what generates energy. That's what generates all motion, all movement, all force, whether it's strong force, weak force, all these crazy forces that modern mainstream mathematics and physics keeps, we discovered a new particle. No, you didn't. There are no particles. These are the same forces that have been at work ever since the dawn of creation. They're the same forces, the only forces that are there. And that's the force of electricity. That's literally the only force that there is. It has its offshoot. It has its effect, which is actually magnetism. A lot of people will even associate, magnetism as the predecessor to electricity. But, I'm not an electrical engineer, so I don't really know that for certain. But I know for certain that, magnetism is a byproduct of electricity. You run an electric current through something, and that's what creates the magnetic field. You can't... I'm not certain about this, but I don't think you can have magnetism without electricity being its antecedent or its predecessor. So the pyramids, essentially, they are energy structures. They are power centers. They are power plants of energy, which essentially a lot of people, it emits this negative ionic field, which, number one, it promotes growth, it promotes life, it promotes health and healing. The negative, which is what negative ionic charge does, which is why, grounding onto bare earth has such a beneficial effect for balancing our polarity, balancing the electrical system of our body, which is a biological electrical battery, an electrical circuit, just as everything in this electric universe is. And so, that's essentially what they are. And the Russian experiments that have, they built their own, I think it was I forget what they built the pyramid out of. I think it was just a plastic pyramid, which itself is a dielectric substance, meaning that it doesn't actually conduct electricity itself. Dielectric means it doesn't conduct electricity. It's a grounding agent. But so what they discovered was that they brought all these extinct flowers. They brought some extinct species of flowers back into bloom. Just completely, they didn't know that any of that was going to happen. You can store seeds. You can store grain. You can store anything biological will preserve itself for a lot longer periods of time while being housed or bathed in the energy of a pyramid, which... And we'll go deep into the symbolism and the biology and the physics and all the other good things that all tie into as a universal science in these film series that we're working on. Is that the human body itself, as you sit in full lotus position in a pyramidal structure or in a tetrahedral structure, you are literally the conduit of the energy of the structure of the vacuum of space itself, which is composed of tetrahedron structures, which build up essentially, which are encompassed by spheres, and those spheres are packed together, which creates cubes. And the cube is essentially, it's the box, it's the container, it's the scaffold, it's the structure of the fabric of space and time itself. And this gets into sacred geometry with Nassim Haramein's work. I believe he is the first one to discover the 64 tetrahedron grid, which was based off its predecessor of Buckminster Fuller, who discovered the vector equilibrium, or the cube octahedron, which is essentially it's the core foundational structure of all energy, all matter, of space and time itself. It is the structure of all biology, and so that is essentially, that's what the pyramids were for. And I mean that the mythology all ties into that directly as well. The mythologies are basically stories that are written in allegories, in parables, in order to portray this timeless wisdom, to tell it in a way that's sort of entertaining, easy, it's distilled, it's easy to grasp, so that you pass that wisdom down. It's basically like a Trojan horse. You pass that wisdom along, embedded within that story, so that it will be preserved for those who may forget it throughout the eons, throughout the ages, whether, cataclysms happen, which wipe out, civilizations 12,000 years ago. So you lose all your records, you lose all your books, you lose all your documentation of this knowledge, but it will be preserved orally, so that the people who survive those cataclysms or those catastrophes can reclaim that knowledge once again, once it starts to awaken from within us. Just as we awaken from a dream, so too does that knowledge. Eventually it bubbles up, it percolates forth, and it comes through. Yes. And so that's ultimately about.
Like you've talked about like a pure consciousness before we come into this realm, and I can see how that's related to the zodiac cycles and even reincarnation. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the metaphysical? And some, like I know in the religious charismatic groups, they have these like their exorcisms, and I know a psychologist might call that abuse. What do you think's happening with these angels and demons and heaven and hell and all that stuff? Is that just thought forms, that space that comes from this stuff, from the mythologies, or is that something that's real and needs to happen?
Well, that's an interesting topic, and a very controversial one, and one that I take a very controversial stance, that I know almost everyone will strongly disagree with me. And, that's okay. I'm not trying to offend or challenge anyone. Well, I am trying to challenge everyone's beliefs, but, and that should be everyone's goal, is to challenge your own beliefs. If they don't stand up to scrutiny, then, then they're not true. And that applies to all, it's funny. I was literally just thinking about this in the shower when, I was just getting ready. I wasn't intending for that to be brought up, but it was just going through my mind, is that all things can be proven objectively, even the most metaphysical things, the mind itself, every belief, every thoughts themselves, even if it's completely intangible, spirit, what have you, no matter what it is in the universe, if it is true, it will be proven, and it can be proven. And it can be proven not just, even if it's just from one angle, but usually, even if it's something metaphysical and, entirely ethereal, it has you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't measure it in any way. It always precipitates down into matter, so there is something that you can always use to validate and substantiate its existence and its credibility. And that's ultimately what my mission, what my purpose, what my goal is to take so many things that are usually just metaphysical, usually just like a lot of fantastical stories and things like that, and to bring them, make them tangible, to where you can actually hold it in your hand. You can point to it, you can show it to somebody else, maybe not as a physical solid object, but you can, that's the goal of what I'm doing, is to try and show people the contents of my mind, to take my mind, show it to you, be like, if I could sculpt it into an object, I would be like, here, this is the thought form. This is literally the form of my thoughts. This is what my thoughts create. And
well, that's sort of what syncretism does, right? It proves things by looking at their relationship to everything else.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, so everything. So the Hermetic principles of correspondence, the laws of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause. And so whether that cause is completely intangible, you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, if it's not observable by the senses, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And that definitely doesn't mean that it can't be proven. Because, it has an effect, whether you can always measure it in some way, shape, or form. For example, love. You can't prove that love is a thing. Like, you can't see it, you can't touch it, but yet you can experience it directly through gnosis, which essentially is what the process of gnosis is. It's experiential knowledge, something that you experience, and by that experience, you are forever changed. It literally changes the structure, its cellular structure of your DNA. It changes your biology. It can change your entire physiology. People can have profound transformations just, from something as experiencing like the honeymoon effect, as Dr. Bruce Lipton shows it so greatly in his work, which is profound. I mean, amazing with epigenetics and all of that. But the actual question about the demonology, the demons, the spirits, the angels, and all of that, that's also going to be a huge segment in this. I mean, I'm trying to write a comprehensive, like really deep, validating it from all aspects of science that I can possibly validate it from, whether it's biology, anatomy, even some aspects of geology in certain ways, but especially the topic of demonology. I've got a full presentation that I'm still trying to produce about demonology itself, the science of demons. It was basically thought forms where in ancient times they were known as egregores, or in other words, it's what Carl Jung calls the collective unconscious, or in other words, Rupert Sheldrake calls it, morphogenetic fields, basically fields of energy, or in other words, the field itself, the field that creates morphology, that it's basically like a field of memory, a collective intelligence that we all are constantly tapped into. We can't get rid of it. We can't hide from it. We can't run away from it. We can ignore it and deny it all we want, but eventually it will hit us like a bolt of lightning, and it will come forth from within us. But so ultimately, everything that we think, everything that we speak, everything that we say, people can take this literally as it becomes real. In a sense that, and I don't mean that necessarily in a literal sense, I mean that in a sense that everything we think, we speak those things that we think that we believe to somebody else, and somebody else has the choice to either believe that or to not believe that. And that's where objectivity and subjectivity comes in, weighing those two balances. Subjectivity only exists within the greater reality of objectivity. In other words, the universe is objective. It's not something that we can, that it changes depending on what we think it is. And we can prove that scientifically. That's what randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials are for, is you control all the variable factors that rule out belief, that rule out, what you think, what you want it to be, and there is still a measurable objective effect, regardless of your belief or what you want to believe. And most people, especially in the New Age and the metaphysical community, cannot accept that. They will not accept that. Can't accept it as being true, and yet it is true. There is an objective. The universe is objective. Reality is objective, but our subjective perception exists within that greater reality. What we perceive, what we want, what we think to be true only exists because there is actually an objective reality that we all share within. And that is what the sacred geometry of the flower of life actually is. Each of us is a spherical boundary. We are a boundary condition, just like any cell and any organism in existence. It has a boundary. That's what the skin is. It is our membrane. It is our physical boundary separating the outer world from the inner world within our bodies. And so, essentially, that is how we operate in this world. So the concept of demons and angels and all of that, it's what you want it to be. You can have your subjective interpretation of it, but ultimately there are thought forms, but those thought forms are basically, they're just collective human beliefs. They're egregores. An egregore is a collective belief, and you can find this in so many stories, so many fairy tales, especially. One of the most prominent off the top of my head is there's a movie called Rise of the Guardians, which is basically all your mythological characters, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, what have you, on and on, so forth. These are all characters that are enlivened through our stories, through our myths, through our collective storytelling. And so they all are based on actual real truths, and those truths are not literal. They're not an actual person that existed. They're not a deity that exists in some metaphysical dimension. These are things that are tangible, but they are allegories for real things that we experience in life, in our experiences of life, that we can point to directly in our physiology and our biology. You know, and I could go into the specifics of each one of them, but that, again, that opens up a huge Pandora's box that, you know, we'll go off on forever.
Yeah, we don't need to do that.
So I'm just trying to kind of give an overarching theme here. But for example, demons. In ancient times, their effects, exorcisms and all of that, is basically, it's all psychological health. It's all about mental health and bodily health and bodily well-being. Holistic, holy, health, holos, whole. That's what it's all about. So the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the demons and all of that, it's all about parasites within the body. From eating high meat, high fat, animal-based, what nowadays is become processed foods, but in ancient times they didn't have processed foods. It was all about the diseases of kings, of royalty, which were, you know, the 7 vices rather than being transmuted into the 7 virtues. Things like gluttony, and, you know, essentially, and killing other animals, eating these unhealthy foods that, and, you know, this is a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. So, you know, I can't go into the specifics about diet, health, nutrition, and all of that here, but that is ultimately what it's all about. Is, you know, we live an unhealthy lifestyle, and that opens you up to be preyed upon by those parasites, because everything can only survive in the environment that is conducive for that thing to survive in. So in other words, you can only harbor parasites if the environment is there to keep them there. Same as the gut microbiome. I mean, you can take all the probiotics in the world, but if you're not eating the starchy, heavily resistant starch-based foods like legumes, beans, potatoes, yams, rice, whole grains, all of those foods that especially, you know, most people demonize, whether you're from the low carb, the paleo, the raw food camp, I don't care. It's everyone's demonizing the core, like the healthiest foods of all the healthiest populations of the world, that we're consuming those foods that keep a healthy environment, that keep your mental health clear. So in other words, these exorcisms, these healings are basically, they're healing people's physiology. It's number one is casting out the serpent. It's casting out the demon, which is, it means it's cleansing your physical body so that it's no longer conducive to harbor parasites and pathogens, whether that's bacterial pathogens or whether that's actual worms, flatworms, roundworms, flukes, etc., what have you, the actual demon, the real demon that is within us. And these demons, these parasites, they control your mind. They release chemicals that tell you what to eat so that it feeds them rather than your own health, so that it will feed them at their expense, at the expense of your longevity and your health. So they literally produce chemicals that control the minds of their host. And so that is ultimately what it all is right there. But there's many other allegories that the demons apply to. The topic of angels applies specifically, I mean, that's a big one in and of itself, but it applies essentially to the zodiac. But it applies also within the physiology of the human body. Once again, there's multiple layers. You know, there's a macrocosmic layer, a huge layer that encompasses a smaller layer that's contained within it, and it's fractal, and it goes, you know, who knows, maybe essentially infinite. But there are many layers around these things. And so that's essentially what the disinformation, the misinformation, the allegories are all about, the parables are all about, is to convey this core truth. It's like you try to feed the truth to a dog, you try to feed something to a dog, you have to wrap it in what it wants. You have to feed the medicine to them wrapped in a piece of bacon or something, so you're giving them that pill, that truth wrapped in that, in that garbage, that facade, that exoteric interpretation that basically, number one, if you take it literally like that, you're kept on the outer, the exo, you're kept excommunicated from the inner temple, the inner house of wisdom, that inner esoteric group of knowledge, which is what the core truth is. So, sorry, I'm going off on tangents. I do that.
That's all right. I just want to say, I think everybody takes some of the text metaphorically, and everybody takes some of it literally. And I say that because I was studying the end times doctrines, and there was the main one I've been studying was recently is the preterist view, and basically the preterists, they take the time statements in the Bible literally, but they'll take all the apocalyptic language metaphorically. So they're already beginning this journey of understanding, okay, what do these metaphors mean? What's this typology that's happening? And I realized that the futurists were taking the apocalyptic language literally and the time statements metaphorically. So everybody's already taking something metaphorically, but we just haven't harmonized the thought. That's why I love syncretism so much, is we're getting back to the ancient Greek way of thinking, which looks at the relatedness of all things. This is the logos, right? This is the Pythagorean way of thinking. And I'm wondering, like, okay, how did it get so bad that everybody was taking the apocalyptic language literally? And so we've been exploring some like this Roman provenance theory, where the Romans were trying to dominate these other cultures' religions, and they would basically create their own religion. What are your thoughts on like the politics behind Christianity?
Yeah, honestly, that's not one of my specialties.
Okay.
That's not really what I'm the best at. That's one of my flaws, is I'm not a historian. Like, I'm not really too concerned. I'm not interested in like the history of things. I'm interested in the history of some things, but not like actual cultural history itself. Like I'm not big on, timelines. I'm not big on dates. I'm not big on, what actual fluidity and continuity of transmission of things like that. But I like to focus on just the more abstract things and sort of correlate those with the more detailed aspects of it. But that is a huge one. Is for any ruling culture, first of all you have to divide the culture amongst itself. Same way that all division functions in the universe, you first have to divide it amongst itself. And in other words, basically a separation. And that's literally what, secret actually means at its root word in Latin. Secret means to separate. So in other words, that's where we get the word secretion from, is basically, because you're secreting something which is separating something off from the whole. So in other words, that's how you first basically penetrate that, basically, think of a sphere of influence, a sphere of knowledge, and you first have to penetrate that. You have to divide that thing into amongst itself. You have to divide that populace amongst itself. The way you do that is through a separation. So the way you do that is through essentially disinformation. And these masters, these learned elders, these elites, these elites of the ancient traditions, they are the masters of psychology. They are essentially they're the fathers and the originators of the science and the study of psychology, which itself means the science of the soul, the study of the soul. Psyche literally meaning soul, from the Greek goddess Psyche. So essentially what they have to do is they have to divide the populace amongst itself. The way they do that is by, number one, demonizing the old traditions, the old gods, and we find this in George Martin's, A Song of Ice and Fire. You have, as well as many other, Lovecraft also, described this a lot as well. That you have separate the old gods, demonize the old gods, or in other words, the old way of life. The traditional ways of life, the common traditions, where we were all essentially. Originally, we were all a functional human species. We all had the same goals, the same purpose on Earth. And originally that was just to survive. It was basically to cultivate our food on the land, maintain a healthy population, which consisted of our family. Our immediate family became our larger community, and all of those things. So the way they did that was, they first demonized the old ways, and start demonizing paganism, which is essentially that is our true foundation, our true root of all of these cultures, all these theologies, all these religions are wrapped basically their lies wrapped around a core truth that is embedded more holistically in paganism, is more fundamentally closer to the truth than any of the other religions that are wrapped around it and that encompass that core truth. So that's they understood that, and the way they did that was they incorporated the old ways. First of all, they fabricated a new story. I mean, and that in of itself is one of the larger. I mean, I can't even fathom how someone can be intelligent and, you know, have the drive and the will and the desire enough to do something like that, to create an entirely new, you know, belief system, an entirely new religion. You know, it basically starts with a wild imagination, you know, for many parts, but it's not really. I mean, because I mean, when you think about wild stuff like Mormonism, like, and all these various offshoots of Christianity, you know, some of them can be very, especially Scientology itself by, you know, L. Hubbard. I mean, that is one right there. Like, how do you create an entirely new religion like that? Well, number one, you have to be a very profound liar and deceiver, which he was provably. I mean, even Aleister Crowley wouldn't touch that guy. He wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. He was like, that guy is a fake. He's a fraud. He's a shill. And I mean, that says a lot for someone like Aleister Crowley to even like disapprove of what you're doing. And that's a wild story in and of itself. But so yeah, that's what they did, was they encompassed all the universal truths about nature, about the functions of the cycles, the seasons, when to plant, when to reap, when to sow, when to harvest. And that's very basic, but the science of nature and astrotheology gets very, very technical. And, you know, it's not complex, it's not hard to understand, but it can get very, very deep and very nuanced. So, but that's ultimately the overarching simplicity, is all about the cycles of time, of the seasons of nature, and the cycles of nature itself, which is this correlates to the cycles of consciousness, the wakefulness and the sleepfulness, the dream state and the alert state. And, you know, that's how all things in the universe go, from ebbs and flows, cycles of expansion and contraction, magnetism, centrifugal divergence, and centripetal convergence. You know, or centripetal convergence, centrifugal divergence. It's all a universal dynamic. It's a torus dynamic, to put it essentially. That's how, I mean, it encompasses everything in existence. But so, you know, that's ultimately how you do it, is you basically encompass people's, you have to steal their roots from them, and then you have to sell it back to them, is ultimately what Rome was the master of. I mean, Rome was and they got all this from the Phoenicians. You know, Rome wasn't the originators of any of these, you know, high priesthood traditions. They got all of their core foundational societal tenets from the Phoenicians, who preceded them, and them from the Babylonians and the Chaldeans and the Sumerians who preceded them. And, you know, we're not going to go by a mainstream linear timeline because, you know, number one, that's actually incorrect. But at some point, and number two, nobody actually knows how it actually went. I mean, we can study the best historians that we have documentation of, but ultimately we can't even trace that fully, because the Vatican is hoarding all of it in the catacombs underneath the Vatican Mount. But so, I mean,
yeah, about that, like I heard that, well, somebody actually told me a couple weeks ago that, he was talking about the burning of the library in Alexandria, and I'm like, did that? So I was like, oh yeah, that happened it happened a couple times, it seemed like, in history, where it was kind of progressive, and it was as Christianity or monotheism came along, they had to get rid of these opposing views. But I heard that the Vatican didn't actually burn it all down. They're like, we want to keep this, and they're storing it now. So I don't know. Have you looked into that much or no?
I haven't studied it in depth, like in detail. Like I haven't gone through and actually studied that, you know, one unique thing. But yeah, I mean,
right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Hypatia of Alexandria is just appalling. I mean, it's such a compelling story. But yeah, of course, you know, the these conquering cultures, I mean, unless they're truly, if someone is not wise, they will destroy the information entirely. But if they're wise as serpents, yet definitely not also gentle as doves, that's what it's all about. Ultimately, the goal is to be wise as serpents, have the wisdom of the Serpent Kings, yet also have the core morality, the core tenets of philosophy to also be gentle as doves. You are powerful. You contain the ability to destroy anything in sight. Yet you have the morality and the free will choice to align yourself with natural law and to never do so, because you understand the vast implications of what will become of not just yourself, but what will become of the entire function of the universe itself. If you do that, you're going against the entire structure of the universe, which is a living organism. It's a living body. It's a whole organism, and you destroy certain parts of it, or even just one part of it, and the whole thing breaks down, and you destroy, everything by extension of that. So so of course they didn't destroy all of that information, and of course they have been hoarding that, although they ultimately they didn't have to anyways. I mean, they had the knowledge to begin with. This core priesthood, this elite priest class, are the ones who not only did they discover all this knowledge, but they're the ones who were writing it, they were documenting it. These were the vast scientists of the ancient world. They were the astronomers, the cosmologists, they were the physicians of their days. These were the elite minds of the ancient world. So of course they were the ones who compiled all this knowledge, and yet somehow along the way, and I used to think I knew how it all worked, but the more I'm learning, I'm like, I have no idea how it works now. So I'm in a transition phase right now, in between my I'm in a period of mental chaos in between my states of order.
Right.
But and that's what we all go through. We go through levels of growth, and in between those levels of growth, there's a vast, everything is chaos in between, just as cymatics goes. But
I was thinking we almost need to have psychology taught in our schools, or maybe at a high school level, so people can be prepared, because what these big psychologists like Steve Hassan are saying is people are actually more vulnerable than they think they are. And there was that movie on Netflix, it was called The Experimenter, where he's experimenting to see how much people will obey an authoritative figure in the room, even though it's an immoral or an evil thing that they're doing, applying shocks.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I recently watched a really good remake of from the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was by I forget, really popular YouTube channel, and it was great. It was one of the best independent shows that I've seen in a while. So he attempted to recreate the Stanford Prison Experiment, and it's a lot harder to do nowadays than it was back in the 70s when they did it. Basically because people are a lot more, they're basically not as willing to go along with authority as we used to be, just even a couple decades ago. But yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, so people will definitely, and there's still, most people, the majority of people in the world are caught and sucked into appeal to authorities. Authority figures is, you look to someone else because you don't feel like you're worthy enough within yourself to number one, be capable of learning or of embodying the principles of someone for example, like Jesus, as he said, so too, these things I do, so too shall you do, and greater things shall you do. So of course that's always been the teaching. The core teaching is that, we all have a greatness within us. And etymologically, this goes back, and mythologically, this goes back to, the genius. The etymological roots of the genius is it's literally the tutelary deity, the tutelary spirit. It's essentially, it's literally your guiding spirit. It is your conscience It is that intelligence within that tells you when something is right and wrong, and that's which we experience as a gut feeling. Like every time you know you've done something like really wrong, your gut it wrenches, it twists, and you can feel it in your enteric brain. You're literally your enteric neurons, which send that signal, that neural pathway from the nervous or the vagus nerve up into the brain, which has a much broader pathway from the gut to the brain than it does from the brain to the gut. So it's basically working its way up. It's basically like, sending that signal up. Yeah. Or in other words, it's sending that message up to the brain. It's sending that message from hell, from the bowels of hell, to the heights of heaven within the physiology, which is the role of Mercury, of Hermes. That's Hermes' job. He's the messenger, but who can pass between the underworld and heaven. He's the intermediary, which is what the nervous system is. The nervous system alchemically was ruled by Mercury. It's not, we're not talking literal here. We're not like, oh, you've got Mercury, running through your vein, running through your nervous system. But although, most people do have Mercury running through their nervous system. Right. Because of the bioaccumulation of toxins and of mercury, which comes essentially through animal foods, specifically and solely through animal foods, which I've covered in vast depth on not just my written presentations, but I finally got an actual video out about that. I've been trying to do videos about that forever, and it's a huge topic also. So yeah, so that's a big one regarding the physiology and health. Right. And again, what causes the mental illness was what causes those, those demons within us. You're hearing, you're schizophrenic, you're autistic. All of these things are usually begin within the gut. They begin with the enteric system, the microbiome, which is not even, it's not even our body. It's an organism of microorganisms, of bacteria. I mean, the human body, what we consider ourselves, what you are, what I am, I am not what I think I am. I'm actually just a giant congregation of mostly bacteria, mostly viruses. We are literally mostly composed of viruses, then mostly composed of bacteria, and then mostly composed of our own cells. But so most of what we're made of is not even what we consider to be us. But yet, these organisms are within us, and it's a homeostatic system. It's a holistic system that gives and takes. And the microbiome is literally, it's the cutting edge of science and health and well-being. Now, that is where the future of health and understanding of basically all health and disease begins and ends in the gut. Yeah, and
I think people can understand that better. Like if they read the church, when they're reading the New Testament, what is the church, right? What did Jesus call Christianity? He said it's the body, right? So and Paul talks about it as you're each, like, does an eye compare himself to a finger, right? So it's actually talking about those things, and it's talking about the actual body. And so you can actually read it like that and begin to see some of this stuff. And the astrophysiology, like in the Lord's Prayer, even he says, may it be on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what is heaven and what is earth? So like we need to define our terms and according to that sort of pagan historical context of the astrotheology. And I think people will start to get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what most people don't grasp, is that they'll demonize Hermeticism and and esoterica as being, that's from the that's satanic, that's from the devil, that's it's evil, and the truth is it's the exact same thing. It's the actual truth of what the scriptures are saying. It's on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, the Hermetic principle of as above, so below is the exact same. That's where the biblical scripture comes from, is from the actual Gnostic Gospels, which itself comes from a much more ancient teaching. But yeah, so that's exactly what it is. And again, it applies, number one, it applies metaphorically to the things that we experience in our day-to-day lives and in our interactions and relationships with each other, as well as our relationship with ourself, with our own, in our own mental our mental sphere, our own mental kingdom, if you will. A kingdom literally means a sphere of influence.
So what would you say to somebody who's just beginning their spiritual journey? They're thinking about going to some different churches and studying some different views. Like, how does somebody start to discern this stuff? Because I know it's really complex and it takes a long time. So, Yes,
it is. Honestly, well, I would say, first of all, start cross-referencing. Like, everything you read, everything you hear, start with the actual quadrivium, and as well as combined with the trivium. Start with the 7 liberal arts. In other words, how we can come to know, the basic fundamentals of the world that we live in, our reality, our existence in this world, and what we're supposed to be, contributing to the world. And that is, the quadrivium, the study of music, astronomy, mathematics, as well as the I forget the 4th one. I'm sorry, I'm not too great with these off the top of my head. But and then the trivium of logic, which is rhetoric, logic, and philosophy. Or I probably got a couple of those wrong off the top of my head. But it's basically that's what we need to be. How we can know ourselves and to know the truth. And to know the truth is to apply that. Basically, what essentially it's the scientific method. People nowadays just do not trust science whatsoever. They hate science. They openly denounce science. And yes, most science has been hijacked and corrupted and is flawed. Most of it's disinformation. Although you can't, people hate science, and this is part of the huge battle that, sorry to bring this up, but it's part of the battle that I'm going right now. Everything I do and everything I'm trying to share and present and teach is the main thing that I'm battling against is people who hate science. And when I say they hate science, I mean they literally think that opinion, hearsay, and personal anecdote, N=1 studies, which literally means that they're performing experiments on themselves by trial and error, all these things. That is not how to get to the truth. For people who are seeking, who are seeking to validate the teachings of the Bible or any other religion, start first with these core tenets of, how to think, how to apply those things, logically and rationally, with substance, with evidence, use rules of evidence, understand the hierarchy of evidence. So in other words, what makes the most credible argument, what makes the most credible case for your stance, for your position, and start to try to actually substantiate your beliefs. The things that you hear, the things that you're taught, the things that you're told, go through and actually fact check them for yourself, cross-reference things. But this requires, most people don't have the skill set to be able to even begin to know how to do those things. But, so that's why it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing journey. We're ongoing. It's an ongoing spiral to that pinnacle of the mountain, which, it's a false, if you're a mountain climber, it's known as a false horizon or a false summit. As you think you're getting to the peak of the summit, you realize that it's not done yet. You still got a whole long way to go.
Yeah, you get to the top of the pyramid and you realize there's another one on top of it. So that's a sort of picture in my mind.
Get to the top of the pyramid and realize it's been truncated, and that there's another pyramid that's elevated aloft in the air that you literally can't even get to because it's aloft in the air. But that pyramid itself is the capstone itself, which is in and of itself is just another truncated pyramid. So again, it's that fractal essence. And to get to that to that truncated, to the capstone, to the pinnacle, to the apex, to what biblically is called the chief cornerstone. And who was the chief cornerstone? Oh, Jesus Christ was the chief. He was the chief cornerstone. He wasn't just the cornerstone of the church, which is just a typical stone on the corner. He was the chief cornerstone, which is the capstone, which is the pinnacle, the peak, enlightenment, the knowledge, the apex, the apex, or the multiple plural apices, just as the Egyptian apis bull, represented the sun once again. So, I mean, so the process is never ending. It's ongoing. It's a never ending journey. It's a never ending story. As you mentioned at the very beginning, when we were talking about the serpent, I forget exactly if that was from scripture or the quote, but the beginning will be the end. Will
that's Isaiah 46:10. He's talking about God will make known the end from the beginning, right? So the whole Bible is one big cycle. It's all about these ages.
And it's talking about the Ouroboros, the serpent, which literally is Greek for for tail eating, essentially means tail devouring. So in other words, it's the never-ending cycle of where something starts and it also ends. It's an ongoing circle. It is a circle. It is a circuit. It is a cycle. And from kyklos, Greek kyklos, which literally means circle, or which means circuit. Right. So it's an electrical battery of energy, of life that is continual. It's ongoing. And that's, what we should seek to model our lives after is the fundamental, not just the structure, but the energetic nature of the fabric of the universe itself. And that's what, our mind and our goals should all be about.
Well, it looks like we're running out of time. How can we find your work? I guess we have your Patreon account, patreon.com/lifting the veil. His YouTube channel you can find on YouTube is Lifting the Veil as well. And he's on Facebook. Can people contact you on Facebook at Lifting the Veil Official or on your personal account?
The Facebook handle is at Lifting the Veil Official. That's also my Instagram account as well. My Twitter is a different one. I should just make it all the same, but it's not. But anywhere you'll find, there's a lot of other people, especially on Facebook. There's a guy who just started a page who literally started Lifting the Veil, and I was like, hey dude, it's actually, I'm registering my trademark. That's literally my trademark brand. It's registered, and you can't do that. Number one, because it makes people are thinking, is that my page?
Well, I think I just found that one actually today.
And I've done literally years and years of hard labor to build this, this work that I'm doing. And, for somebody else to just come along and piggyback off it, that's why it's a trademark infringement. But yeah, so you can. It's easy to find me. Either Cullen Smith, Lifting the Veil. You'll know the difference between what's my stuff and what's not my stuff, because you'll obviously be able to discern the difference in the writing style, in the way I piss a lot of people off by my sense of humor, my crude language, which I like to incorporate because I like to keep myself. I used to not use, crude language or anything, but, I've sort of loosened up on myself and been like, you know what, we need to have some fun here. People, and I like to sort of challenge people now, in a sense that I think people need to toughen up, and I think the way to toughen people up is to be like, things aren't always going to be as nice and as sweet as you want them to be.
Well, it wakes people up a little bit, right? So
and I feel that that's a lot of more of the energy that I bring is I like to I shake things up that need to be shaken up and shaken out of a habit and out of a pattern, and then you can restructure and re-solidify yourself into a new way of into a new lifestyle, a new way of thinking, into a new mindset. So it's just about that. I'm trying to initiate a transition, of the mind, of the consciousness, and of the physical body itself as well. And, that the reason why is because that's what I had to go through in order to realize, this true potential that we are meant to be operating at, and that we are meant to reach, and that we can reach. It is within reach. The truth can be known. The truth will always be known. It cannot be hidden. It cannot be covered up. And, the way to do that is we have to do the self work. We have to know thyself. Otherwise, we can't really know anything else around us. But it's a two-way street. You can also learn to know thyself by knowing your surroundings. That's what science is for. Science is knowing the things around us, knowing the world around us by studying them, by dissecting them, and by examining them, while gnosis is the experience of knowing from within through direct experience. So these are the two pillars of truth and knowledge, is science and gnosis. The two ways of science literally means to know, from the root word of Latin of I forget how it's pronounced technically. So any professional linguists out there, don't crucify me, but it's either, I think it's shire, means to know. But that's by knowing by external means, by studying things, right, and by, dissecting the parts, and by studying the parts, you can understand the whole. But gnosis is the other way around. It's knowing the whole and thereby being able to observe the parts that it influences. So that's what I think that's a good place to end the show. I just want to say thanks for joining us today. I'm glad to have you. Maybe we can do something again. And yeah, you know where to find us. All right, know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Bye, everybody.